how much do we understand about what Donald Trump actually wants to do? This is, in his mind, he wants to rebalance the wrong that the U.S. has been submitted to for the last decades.
He's decided, and of course we can get into it because obviously he wants to use tariffs for a lot of different things.
Yeah.
But the essence of the reciprocity idea is to unpick the basic system on which the global trading system has been based, the basic principle, which the US has helped to underpin since World War II, since the whole Bretton Woods conference all those years ago. And that's that in effect the way the system worked was you would have the developed economies, and particularly the US, would lead the way in opening their economies and be progressively helping to lower trade barriers, not just for their own economies, but also around the world. And a rising tide would lift all boats. It certainly did. We had rising global trade as a share of the global economy. It is true that in this scenario, particularly developing economies, poorer economies who were in Asia, many of them very poor at that point, had higher barriers around their economies than the US did. But the bet by successive US administrations was that's worth it in the long run if these countries get rich and provide markets for us. He is fundamentally repudiating that. He says that for too long, countries have taken advantage of that. Even as they have got rich, they have still had trade barriers around them. And even countries, and I think this is the one that's a bit more controversial, even parts of the world like the European Union, which on the face of it have very low trade barriers, lower than the US in some cases, he feels they've been giving the US a raw deal by skewing the playing field in other ways. So he's just out to fix it all. It's broken and it's not fair to American workers. I think the question that's going to be hanging over the announcements later today, the end of the day, European time, is whether this is a permanent shift that he's looking for, which, by the way, would also maybe raise some money. He's talked about getting a lot of tariff revenues from this to help the budget, or a first move in an effort to negotiate everybody's barriers down.
And this feels like the big question, right? Whether this is money that he wants to then fund the tax cuts, or whether this is a negotiating position. And depending on what the market interprets, I guess it could go either way.
Yeah, I think if you're sitting in the markets, and we will obviously be at 9 o'clock European time, 4 o'clock in the US, we will be there with our spreadsheets. We have our BICO models on the terminal. Our trade economists are ready to go, whatever he throws at us. But we will. I think we will have the immediate impacts, but I think we'll also be assessing from the shape of what he's done, and whether or not this is mainly about making money, oversimplifying, or mainly about negotiation. And roughly speaking, I would say the lower the kind of headline rates are, the more you would tend to think, okay, he doesn't necessarily want to fundamentally unpick supply chains here. He wants to make a bit of money. He wants to charge an entry fee for the US market. He doesn't want to actually force people to change their production. And the interview he did with our own editor-in-chief, he kind of actually suggested that last summer. He said sometimes you have a very high tariff barrier when you really want to bring things back. I think cars is probably a case where he really wants a lot of car production to come back to the US. He doesn't think Mexico and Canada are close enough. But in other areas, maybe he just wants to charge a price of admission.
So what's the right way? And I find it surprising that, we understand through our reporting in Washington and your great team out there that they're still trying to figure out what the right balance is. And so is there a way of doing tariffs that doesn't really hurt inflation too much, that doesn't really hurt growth too much?
Well, you get the sense, and this was true to a lesser extent in the first Trump administration, but there are plenty of voices within the administration, I think Scott Bessent to some degree, Stephen Moore potentially, I think, or Kevin Hassett certainly, that are looking for ways to do this in a methodical way to give countries a chance to lower their trade barriers and end up with a kind of win-win. But they're constantly pushing against a much more extreme version of this, which I think Donald Trump kind of feels in his bones, which is much more about the more dramatic thing, bringing production back to the US, whatever it costs. He said in a Fox interview last weekend, I don't care if US car makers increase the price of cars. I mean, that is a very interesting statement.
Yeah, because he could crash the economy, essentially. Or is that going too far? But you could see a situation where there's not enough, investment spending because chief executives don't really know what they're looking at, even in the US, and the employment market starts to get a big hit.
Yeah, and this is actually one of the questions that the Federal Reserve has been grappling with, because you want to, if this is a sort of semi-permanent, quite significant increase in US average tariffs, we're pretty sure we're going to go back to the highest level since the 30s, and maybe, depending on what the reciprocity looks like, could be higher than the 1930s, the infamous Smoot-Hawley levels. If we go back to that, and if it's permanent,
right,
does that just add to inflation, or does it actually not add so much to inflation because you've really crimped the economy, because you're cutting jobs, because companies are pulling back? And I don't think we don't know the answer to that, but I think the Fed is tending to feel there's a stagflationary impact. So there's a hit to the economy. Some of our measures look like it could be 3 or 4% of GDP over a few years, and you get a step change in inflation which doesn't go away.